Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's training industry webinar, The Skills and Behaviors Behind High-Performing Learning and Development Leaders. So I'm Liz Spate, the Events Marketing Specialist here at Training Industry, and I'm thrilled to have you with us here today. Before we get started, I would like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of today's program. So a lot of you have done so, but if you haven't, let's open up those chat windows and let us know where you're joining us from today. Feel free to use the chat window to interact with our speaker and your fellow attendees. As for questions, though, please submit your questions for our speaker using the Q&A function within our Zoom toolbar, and we'll address your questions during the Q&A portion at the end of today's session. However, if we do run out of time, no fear, our amazing team will be reaching out shortly to address all the questions you've asked. And with that, we also encourage you to share your key takeaways from today's event with your network on social media. So please follow us on Training Industry Inc. and hashtag TI webinars as you share your favorite takeaways with your colleagues. And when today's event ends, you should receive a short evaluation survey. We always welcome your feedback on things like the content, speakers, topics, or anything else you would like to share with us. So be sure to complete that survey after the event. And as always, today's webinar will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive a follow-up email from us that will include the link to the on-demand program for you to share with your team and plenty of resources. And with that, if you've attended one of our programs in the past, thank you so much for joining us again. But if this is your first event with us, we would love to give you a big welcome. Training Industry exists to make connections among learning and development professionals, and we offer tons of resources to support your role in L&D, like live events like today's webinar. We have articles on our website, our magazine, conferences, research reports, podcasts, courses, and our membership community, exclusive resources, and get AI-powered support. So we have a lot of goodies here. But with that, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today. We have Dr. Amy DuVernet, who is an accomplished industrial organizational psychologist, recognized for her expertise in talent assessment, development, and organizational effectiveness. As Training Industry's Vice President of Learning Products, DuVernet oversees all processes related to training industry courses for training professionals, including program development and evaluation. So with that, Dr. Amy, take it away.
Thanks, Liz. Happy to be here, and thank you all for choosing to spend your morning, afternoon. I saw some evenings in there as well with us today. I'm so excited to be talking to you about our research on what kind of defines high-performing learning leaders and what are those key competencies related to those. So a quick overview for you about our what we're going to cover today. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about career paths and role progression to get the lay of the land. How are we kind of getting promoted into these leadership roles? And then we'll hop into a discussion of Training Industry's Training Manager Competency Model and talk a little bit about the responsibilities and the competencies that are required for this kind of role. We'll then move to our latest and greatest, the Senior L&D Leader Competency Model, which we just kind of released out to the world. So very excited to share that with you. We'll wrap up the session today to talk about career transitions. So how do you prepare for those transitions? And also spend a little bit of time talking about your own development plan and what your next steps might be if you are aspiring to one of these kinds of roles. Before we get into it, I do want to launch our first poll here. So just to kind of get an idea of who's in the room, tell us what describes your current role. Are you an individual contributor? Are you new or aspiring into that training manager role? Maybe you find yourself in a more higher level leadership role. It looks like we've got a couple of VPs and CLOs. So tell us what best describes your role currently. And if nothing on the screen best describes it, use the chat and tell us what it is in the chat feature. So it looks like we have about 62% responded. Maybe we give everyone 20 more seconds to respond, and then we'll close it out and see who we have in the room. All right, going once, going twice. Let's close and see who we have. Okay, so we have a really good mix here. We've got 22% individual contributor. We've got 10% in that newer aspiring role, 30% who are in that training manager role. That's not surprising that that's maybe the winner of today's poll here, but also some folks who find themselves in the upper level leadership, and we also have some consultants. All right, great. Well, thank you all for weighing in there. Before we get into career paths, I do want to take a minute and talk a little bit about why we're focused on learning leaders. So, why do the research? Why spend the time to talk about this today? And the big reason is that, at Training Industry, we do a ton of research on what are the key capabilities, what are the key processes, what defines high performing training organizations. And in that research, we've consistently found that characteristics related to training managers are number one predictors of training organization performance. So we use regression analyses and even some advanced structural equation modeling to weigh out the individual kind of contributions of various contextual factors, size, all kinds of things, use of learning technology. And overall, and pretty consistently, we find that training managers are the number one predictor. So really a key kind of critical component of a high performing training organization. And yet we also see that training managers are underserved, right? So we spend a lot of times thinking about the development of our learners and what they need to perform well. A lot of folks find themselves in the training manager role without any development or any kind of preparation. And so we felt that it was really important to focus on learning leaders and understand what it is that you need to be successful in your roles, and what are those competencies and what are those development experiences that are going to help you there. So let's talk about career paths and role progression. So how do we get into these roles? How do we become a training manager? And we do a lot of research here on the careers and salaries of learning leaders, of learning and development professionals, to kind of see one, what is the salary range for various roles, but also what roles make up the training department, all of these things. So we really are very interested in learning and development careers here. And one of the key ones here is training manager. And so up at the top here, you see training role. It's one of the key factors that might lead into a training manager. So maybe you have experience as an instructional designer, a content developer, maybe you facilitated, you might have been a training specialist who consulted with other parts of the business to help kind of understand needs. This is one of the major pathways into training manager, but actually it's not as big as you might think. So about 30% of training managers had a previous training role, which leaves a large chunk of individuals who didn't have a previous training role and didn't have that experience. Now, they might have knowledge, though. So another key factor is the advanced degree and credentials. So people who have a master's or a PhD in education, or maybe they have a certification like the CPTM or CPLP, they've got something that designates and validates that they have this knowledge around training and development. That's another key pathway into a training manager role. But again, still not making up the bulk of how people get into that training manager role. So the other two here on the slide, subject matter expert and functional manager, this is such a common pathway into training manager. People are really, really good at sales, for example, and so they get tapped. They must, if they're really good at sales, know how to train the workforce to do better at sales. And so all of a sudden they find themselves the training manager of sales for the organization. And it's one of those situations where, yes, they understand what it takes to be a successful sales professional, but maybe they don't really know what it takes to design training, to deliver training. What are all the processes involved in that? Another key kind of pathway into training manager is our functional managers. So maybe you have managed something in the operations team. So you have a really good understanding of what it takes to manage a team. You also have a good understanding of what it takes to be successful in that operational role. So now you've been tapped to be a training manager to think about how to train the workforce in that area. And yet you probably don't have that background to really understand, how do I assess training needs? How do I match those needs to content development? So again, like I said, this is a fairly underserved role, in that so many people find themselves in this role without that kind of development and focus on what it takes to really understand and run that training organization. One that's not featured on this slide, but I'll just call it out because it's another key pathway into this role, is individuals who've worked in K through 12 or universities who have facilitated, who have designed the curriculum for students and have a really good understanding of learning principles. That's another key kind of pathway into corporate training and that training manager role. All right, so basic point of this slide is that the pathways into training manager are really varied. There's no one right or wrong way into that training manager role. When we go up from the training manager and look at the L&D executive, so we're talking about training directors, we're talking about CLOs or VPs, what we see is that it's a lot less random, a lot more predictable what those experience sets were before someone got into those roles. And that training manager role really appears to be the bridge there. So 43% of training directors were formerly training managers, 45% of CLOs were formerly training directors, which means that they were probably also formerly training managers, and 27% of CLOs moved right from training manager to that CLO role. So what you see here is that, yes, there are lots of different pathways into training manager. Once you get to that executive role, you've probably had that training experience. So now I am going to ask you for a quick reaction. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see reactions. I've seen some people throw in some reactions on the side here. I'm interested to know how you would describe your path so far. So give us a thumbs up if you're on track, maybe a heart if you're not necessarily sure if you're on track, but you're being intentional about it. I see we've got some surprised faces. Yeah, we're still figuring it out. That's great that you chose to come to this session, because I think that, or I hope that by the end, you'll have a better idea of where you might want to land. And I love seeing all these preparing for the next level. This session should be really helpful for you as well. Those nonlinears, we know, we get it. Like, the pathway in training is not always going to be one straight path. So love to see that there are nonlinears here. You get a lot of different kinds of experiences. Okay, so now I am going to switch gears and talk a little bit about competency modeling. And we're going to talk through our competency models that we've developed. But before we do, I just want to level set what is a competency model. So a competency model defines the knowledge, skills, abilities that are critical for success for a given job role or function. So a couple of pieces there. We are really focusing in on a specific job when we talk about this. Interestingly, a competency model is a little different than your traditional job analysis, because it's going to combine the work, right? So what are the responsibilities? What are the tasks? What is the person required to do to perform well in the job? It combines those with characteristics of the worker. So what are those key knowledge, skills, abilities that they need to be able to perform those specific kinds of responsibilities? So competency models are really, really great tools in learning and development, and also HR. They bring objectivity. They allow us to have more consistency across our HR processes, more clarity on what it takes to be successful in those roles. Up here, we have some of the most common uses for a competency model. Obviously, development is the one that we're most kind of focused on here today, but also career pathing, so understanding what different roles might lead into based on the competency set that they've developed in those roles. Obviously, choosing project teams, you may need certain competency sets on those teams, so being able to choose based on that. Hiring is a highly litigious field, so making sure that you've got that validated competency model can really help there. And then performance management. How do we define performance for a given role? If we don't have a map of what that looks like, it's going to be really hard to rate performance or understand whether somebody's doing a really good job. So why did we need a competency model here at Training Industry? Well, as I mentioned, we know that learning leaders are this kind of key linchpin to defining the success for a high-performing training organization. And these roles are complex and they are high level. And so having a competency model that describes them helps to kind of simplify and create unity and agreement and alignment around what it takes to be successful in those roles. Also, as I mentioned, these are under-supported roles. We don't have a lot of development as we're getting into these roles. And so we felt that it would be important to provide some of that development and to really kind of think about what it is that learning leaders need to be successful in those roles. So when we went out and tried to think through what we would do to create this competency model, we had to balance some considerations. We had to think about how specific it needed to be, while also how general. So it needed to apply across industries. We know that training managers work in all kinds of industries. There's name an industry that doesn't have this training manager role, or where this training manager role would not be useful. Organizational structures. So training departments tend to be structured in different ways. Organizations tend to be structured in different ways, and yet that training manager role still exists. So we wanted to make sure that the competency model would work across those kinds of things. We also know that training managers can be found internationally in all countries across the world. So geographic location really needed to be, we needed to make sure that the model fit regardless of where they were located. And then this last one, time, was really important to us. So we know that this role is going to shift and change over time as the work changes, as technologies change. But we definitely wanted to make sure that we didn't just do the work and it was immediately outdated. So we wanted to make sure that our competency model would last, that it would still remain relevant over time. So really briefly, just going to talk you through a little bit of how we developed it, and then we'll get right into the models. You can see a little visual of both models on the right side of your screen. Step one, we defined the responsibilities. So we worked with focus groups of subject matter experts, people who were in those roles, people who worked with those roles, people who supervised those roles, to really get a good understanding of what the core responsibilities were in those roles. Again, as I mentioned, competency models are going to pair responsibilities and tasks with what it takes to be successful in those. So the first step was to understand, well, what are the responsibilities of a training manager, or what are the responsibilities of that senior executive L&D role? The next step was to identify competencies. And in this way, we were not trying to narrow it down. We really wanted to create the most comprehensive list of competencies that could possibly be relevant. So we did a ton of research to understand what competencies had been identified across the research literature, what competencies were out there, and really tried to create this long inventory of all the possibly relevant competencies. Our next step was to refine that list. So again, we went to those focus groups of those subject matter experts, those job incumbents, their supervisors, their peers, and asked them, what do we miss? That was really important to us. So we definitely wanted to reduce the list, but we also wanted to know, what are we missing here? And then we asked them, is there anything here that's not relevant that we should take out? With that long list of competencies, our next step was to draft the model, to kind of understand how it all fits together, and get that feedback from our focus groups. Step 5, we validated the model. So we took that and we asked a bunch of training managers, a bunch of senior L&D executives to rate the frequency by which they were using these competencies and engaging in these responsibilities, as well as the importance, how critical it was to job performance in that role. And that gives us a good sense of, how often are we using it, but also, how important or how much does this matter when we think about high-performing training professionals. In doing that, we did an analysis of agreement and trying to understand, are there disagreements across locations, for example, or are there disagreements kind of depending on whether you're in a small organization or a large organization? So we did a lot of analysis to make sure that what we were looking at would apply across these kinds of contexts. Our last step was to finalize it. So crunch all the numbers from our survey of hundreds of job incumbents to kind of whittle it down to what were the most important responsibilities, the most important competencies. And then we worked with our graphic design team to come up with a visualization that would be simple enough to communicate the information, but detailed enough so that you could get what you needed out of it. All right, so that's the 6 steps that we followed. Let's talk about the models. So first of all, I just want to kind of define the training manager. So here you see our training process framework. Those of you who are CPTMs, this should be a very familiar process or a very familiar model for you. Just basically tries to organize what's happening in the training department across different process areas. when we're talking about the training manager, we're talking about this individual here at the bottom of this process who is really overseeing everything. And I will say, as a training manager, you may be kind of focused in on one area. So maybe you're overseeing all of the content management area. Maybe you're overseeing all of the instructional designers. You might be a training manager who is a department of one. So you may also be facilitating and developing courses, and you may also be doing vendor management, but you're charged with managing the whole process as well. So training managers can be training departments of one as well. So we don't want to limit there. All right, so this is who we're looking at. What do they need to be successful? Here is our model. And I'll walk you through it. So here in the middle, we have strategic alignment. This is our most important core responsibility. So across years and years and years of study, we have found that strategic alignment is consistently rated as the most important. Underneath it, you see the competencies that are most critical to be successful on that core responsibility. We have 6 other responsibilities that were identified as kind of core to the training manager role. So to your left, you see developing and delivering solutions. This one is interesting because it is kind of what we call our tip of the iceberg. When we think about training and development, this is the piece that everybody sees. This is the piece that everybody thinks about the training manager being responsible for. And yet there are so many other pieces of that puzzle. Also very important is this evaluate performance. So this was kind of this design of the model was intentional. These 3 are the ones that were kind of rated most important. Evaluating performance is really key to understanding if your training was effective, but also to understanding if your workforce is performing well. So you've got your core competencies related to that there. And then identifying needs, optimizing processes, managing technology, and selecting and managing resources. I should say that selecting and managing resources is not just who you hire onto your team and how you manage them. It's also how you select your vendors, how you manage your vendors as well. So all of that's kind of encompassed in that core responsibility. At the bottom here, we have our foundational competencies. These are pieces that all managers really are going to need. So you have to have integrity and honesty to manage a team. You have to be able to drive performance through others. So those are less training related and more just needed as a training manager. And one thing I should note is that we have this little icon here. When you see this icon, that means that we have a resource available for you. So I'm going to ask my colleague Christina to pop that resource for you. You can learn more about the Training Manager Competency Model there. Okay, so how are we doing on these core responsibilities? I should caveat that this is self-report data. So this is how people view themselves as performing these responsibilities. And we've been collecting this data for almost 10 years. So we've gotten a lot of perspectives on this. Pretty consistently, we see that training managers feel really good about the top 3. So they feel pretty good about selecting and managing resources, about strategic alignment, about developing and delivering solutions. Pretty consistently, they're struggling with evaluating impact. So are my programs really driving success? And so when we think about all of those, we just want to really understand kind of what do we need to be successful in those areas. So let's talk a little bit about what performance looks like there. As a training manager, operational discipline should really be your motto, right? We really want to make sure that we have tight processes, that we are continually optimizing them, that we've got repeatable ways of work. So for the strategic alignment responsibility area, great performance is going to be challenging those low value requests and prioritizing your efforts. So making sure that you're really focused on things that align with business priorities. In the needs analysis area, really important that you're separating what is an actual skills, knowledge gap and what is more related to other aspects of the context. So this is your area where a differentiator for you is going to be knowing when it's a training problem and when it's not. When we talk about measurement or evaluating performance, defining success before you launch a program is really critical, creating alignment on that, and then making sure that those evaluative pieces of information, that you're using those to inform your decision making and to improve what you're doing in your organization. Resource management, this is one where you really need to make your trade-offs visible. Make it really clear what it is that you're doing, how you're deciding between different kinds of resources, how you're funding them, and what those trade-offs are. Here, process optimization, this is the one that's kind of after my heart, so the responsibility after my heart, because it is so important, especially in an organization where you have limited resources, where you feel overwhelmed, that you're putting in the effort to standardize the ways that you do work, so that they don't depend on a single individual, and so that you can repeat them over time, right? So each new request isn't a totally new project. You've got standardized, repeatable ways of approaching them. When we look at developing and delivering learning, think about which approach you want to use. So don't just pick the one that's most familiar or most convenient, but really understanding who that audience is, what their constraints are, and what's going to be the best modality for that individual or for that learning group. And then for learning technology, oh, gosh, there are so many learning technologies. So understanding your full learning tech stack, how does it all fit together, as well as really managing the learning technology from and that cycle from selecting which learning technology you're going to use, ongoing optimization, because we know technologies are constantly kind of releasing new updates, and then retirement. So really thinking about that cycle and making sure that you're managing it. Now, when we ask learning and development professionals, where's your biggest need? Where would you like the most development? If you had to focus on one responsibility area to develop, which one are you picking? Always strategic alignment. So that is an interesting finding, given if we go back to performance, it's number 2, right? So learning leaders really think that they're doing a great job at strategic alignment, and yet if they have to choose, they're picking strategic alignment for development. Makes a ton of sense, though, because we know that it's that most important piece of that responsibility puzzle. And so if we can do better in that area, we should. I think that it's really interesting that developing and delivering solutions falls at the very bottom of that chart. So we ask them what they need. This is the place where they are least likely to select a need for development. Again, I think that just points to the fact that even though this is the piece that we think about the most when it comes to training and development, there is so much more that goes into a successful training department. All right, so now it's time for our next poll. I'm curious, and I picked the 5 that were kind of the most selected in our research, but if you were to focus on one training management capability, which one would improve your results the most? And there are no wrong or right answers, just curious which one you think would be the most important to focus on. And if it's not on the chart, definitely tell us in the chat. I'm curious. I want to hear what it is that would be your focus area. Yeah, I see someone said all of the above. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, we have about 70% who have weighed in, so we'll give 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Speak now, forever hold your peace. Okay, so look, we see, wow, so evaluating business impact is the number 1. All right, I love it. So this is actually, my favorite area. My background in IO psychology means that I love metrics and I love evaluation. So I'm really, really excited and pumped to hear that that's an area that you want to focus. And then, of course, aligning to training to business objectives, we always see that as a key factor that we want to focus on. So thank you for sharing, you all. And I will move to our next slide, because now we're going to talk a little bit about the senior L&D leader. and talk a little bit about the competency model that we have created here at Training Industry. So first, let's level set. Who are our senior leaders? Here we have a bit of a hierarchy. You can see training manager is really that person who oversees all of those individual contributors, or if you're training department of one, all of these processes. Training manager really is overseeing all of that. And then one step above is that senior level L&D professional. So this is somebody who probably oversees several training managers and who kind of has more of that seat at the table in terms of setting direction for the training organization. So one of the things that we did as a bit of a due diligence as we were trying to come up with the senior leader competency model was to look and see, how do senior executives compare to training managers on this training manager competency model? So put simply, would this model work for senior executives? Do we need a new one? And we saw a lot of similarities, but what we saw is that senior executives had kind of mastered a lot of these areas in a way that training managers hadn't. So 66% of senior executives are rating themselves above average in strategic alignment compared to 44% of training managers, just showing that that senior executive level has a lot more confidence in this area. Looking at evaluating performance, a similar pattern. Senior executives are feeling a lot more confident in their ability to perform this competency area. Similarly with identifying needs, so a lot more confident in understanding what the needs of the business are. That makes a lot of sense when you get to that executive level. That's going to be a really critical component. And then the last one that we found some pretty big differences is optimizing processes, where senior executives tended to think that they were performing above average far more often than kind of training managers. So definitely saw some differences there. Of course, we did all of the due diligence, all of the steps that I went over earlier to kind of think through what is that senior leader. We also talked a lot about what it means to go from a training manager to a senior leader. So how does your perspective shift? Because it really isn't super different. What is different is that your scope of what you're thinking about is different. So rather than thinking about the day-to-day operations of your training organization, you're expanding to think more broadly about the organization and think about training from a more macro level. So as a training manager, you might spend a lot of time prioritizing what the validated needs are in your organization. As a senior leader, you might spend more time identifying what those enterprise capability needs are. So how do we invest in the future of our enterprise? As a training manager, you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about how programs align to business goals, or at least if you're a really good high-performing training manager, this is going to be a key factor for you. But as a senior leader, you might spend more time trying to influence at the executive level to really kind of help shape what those business goals and objectives are. As a training manager, you're going to be measuring solution effectiveness. You're going to be evaluating whether your training solutions are really driving business impact. But as a senior leader, you're representing the training organization. So you're going to spend a lot more time communicating the value of learning across the organization. You'll take some of that data from your training manager, but what you're doing is really trying to shape the perception of the training organization. As a training manager, you're going to be managing resources and delivery. As a senior leader, you're going to be thinking more about the operating model and do we have our training department structured correctly to best react and best serve our business? And then finally, training managers are going to be improving those day-to-day processes. Senior leaders are going to be thinking about leading change across that learning function. So less about those kind of micro improvements and more about sweeping improvements that might help prepare the training function to serve the business and the future needs. Okay, so without further ado, our latest and greatest model, which we are so proud of. Again, you see that little download icon. Christina will pop that resource if you want to learn more about our senior L&D leader competency model, but I'll talk you through it now. We have strategic alignment here in the middle. And that is on purpose and that is intentional. It is one of the most critical things that a learning leader is going to do as a training manager and as a senior executive. And so we did place it in the middle for a purpose. And you can see that the competencies related to strategic alignment have changed, right? So yes, you're going to be using strategic thinking, but also you need to understand what the root cause of things are. You need to be using data to drive your decisions. There's a vision and communication component, right? Because we're not just thinking about aligning our programs, but we are also thinking about how we influence and how we speak and how we share out that alignment and make sure that people are perceiving our programs as being aligned. Moving to our top left, we have executive influence, which is related to that. So here we're really thinking about how are we influencing at that executive level? How are we demonstrating executive presence? How are we negotiating with our peers? What are we doing to really create the networks that are going to help our learning department be successful? Going clockwise, we have financial management. This is an area where I think a lot of L&D professionals feel a little underserved. So we are going to have P&L responsibility at this level, which means that we need to have that financial literacy. It means that we need to be able to forecast, and we also need to understand the trade-offs in terms of resource investments. Moving along, learning oversight. So yes, as a senior executive leader, we are going to still be managing and overseeing the learning function, but it is a little different than that training manager in that we're not necessarily going to be thinking about the day-to-day, but instead we're going to be thinking about the strategy for our learning department. We're going to be thinking about innovation. So just a more macro view of that. Down here at the bottom, we have technology and resources. Learning technology does not go away at this level, and it's still really important as a senior L&D executive that you have that learning technology exposure. Here, though, it's more important that you're thinking about strategy. So you're not going to be in the nitty-gritty understanding how your LMS operates, but you are going to be thinking, as we roll out new AI tools, how might we be incorporating that into what we're doing? Is that something that would make us more effective? So again, more future focused. Here we have team leadership. As a senior executive, you're probably going to have a team of training managers reporting into you. So you do have to be able to develop them. You do have to be able to help them work well together. So those pieces are still there. And then finally, and last but certainly not least, change leadership. Organizations are changing rapidly, as we know, and L&D is one of the key tools that businesses can use to really help them with that change, help them be agile. And so having this core responsibility and the competencies related to it means that we're going to be able to help prepare our workforce to be resilient. We're going to be able to help them be ready for that change, and we're going to help lead that organization through that. So my next slide is a little silly. We did ask how important all these responsibilities were, and I just wanted to share that they are all important. Technology and resource management is at the bottom there at 90%, so maybe tiny bit less important, but as it turns out, it is really critical that you master all of those. And that is not surprising. As you move to that executive level, that role is going to become more complex, obviously, and so you are going to have mastered some of these. What is nice is that as a previous training manager, as most people who get to this role have been, you have a lot of foundational competencies that help to lead into these. So we asked aspiring senior leaders, so not folks who are in that senior executive role, but the folks who are aspiring to get into that role, how confident they feel across all of these competencies. And this chart is a little backwards, so let me explain it. We asked them to say, which areas are you feeling the least confident in? They were allowed to pick 3, so that's why the numbers don't add to 100. But what you see here is that financial management is the area that people feel the least confident, and that is not surprising. Again, having that P&L responsibility is something that's going to stretch you. It's going to put you in a different capability area than what you've necessarily had in the past. Executive influence is also not surprising. Getting the opportunity to interface with executives and to really see how they react and to kind of get that role model is going to be really critical in this area to try to develop that area. Not shocking that team leadership is at the bottom. Like I said, as a former training manager or a current training manager, you probably have a lot of great experience in that area. All right, so let's talk about how those responsibility areas translate into performance. When we talk about moving to that senior level role, we're really talking about expanding our scope across the organization. So when we think about strategic alignment, we're talking about how does that enterprise strategy translate into our investments. We talk about, and by the way, let me just say, it's not even just translating it, it's making sure that you are communicating that in a way that your entire training function understands. Because it's one thing for you to know that, but if your instructional designer doesn't really understand that translation, it's not gonna, we're not gonna see that in our final results. Executive influence, what does that look like? It looks like all of these conversations with key executives that allow us to negotiate and to influence and to build credibility and to make sure that they understand the value that we're bringing to the organization. Also to make sure that we understand what all of those current and future business problems are. Financial management, that we are justifying our investments, that we are making sure that people understand those are good investments. Learning function oversight. Here we're talking about structure. We're also talking about governance and we're talking about standards. So really trying to set up these standards so that the learning function is operating well. Technology, definitely managing the ecosystem, understanding the vendor system and how those resources are being allocated. We talk about team leadership. Now we're not just leading individual contributors, but we need to be developing leaders and thinking about that succession planning. And then finally, change management. I highlighted it before, just so important that we're creating vision, that we're getting sponsorship for changes, and that we're really helping with that transformation. Okay, so we have our final poll, I think. I'm curious to know which senior leader capability matters most for your next step. So maybe you are aspiring to that senior leader level role. Which one do you think would be most important for you to focus on as you think about transitioning into it? And if you're not targeting the senior level yet, no worries. We had the whole Training Manager Competency Model with lots of areas that you can focus on. And of course, tell us in the chat, what is it if you don't see what you want to focus on there, what is it that you think would be best to focus on? I'll give you maybe 20 more seconds. Okay, looks like we have about 60% who have responded. Let's give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's have a look. Executive influence. Okay. Yeah, this is one that I think there are a lot of resources out there, but it's one where practice and experience can be so critical and important. So I agree, that's one that's going to be really effective. Strategic alignment, again, gosh, we always see that up at the top, so not surprising there. All right, well, let's move to our next section. We're going to talk a little bit about career transitions. So you all probably came here with some ideas in mind for where you'd like your learning and development careers to go. Hopefully I can share some insights that'll help you along your way. First thing is that I want to encourage you to do your due diligence. Gosh, people often think I want to be a CLO because that's the next step, right? But then when they actually look at what that role requires, they realize, no, I don't. There are a lot of things that you lose as you move up through the ranks. You're not going to be facilitating. You're not going to be developing programs. So I want to make sure that you ask yourself and just really pause and think, do I really want this kind of work? Is this something that would enrich me and make me feel happy? Because it's not the only career progression out there for you. And if you're not sure what it takes, obviously go through that competency model, look at it in more depth, but find somebody in those job roles and do your informational interviews to kind of find out what does the day in the life look like. Ask yourself, what are the decisions that this role would make that I'm not making today? What are the business problems I'd be expected to solve? What are the relationships and sponsorships that would be required for me to get there? So here you're starting to think about, okay, how do I start laying the groundwork to get there? Is there evidence right now that would show I'm already operating at that level? If there is, start documenting it. The last one is the opportunity available in my current organization, I think is one to really think about. I think a lot of people see that there isn't that executive level in their organization, or maybe there's somebody already in that level who's not leaving anytime soon. So ask yourself if it's available. If it's not available, if the role just doesn't exist, I'm gonna send a follow-up email to everyone after the webinar, and I'm gonna share an article, great article from one of our editors, Sarah Gallo. She wrote a piece about advocating for this executive role in your organization. So I would say don't assume that it's not possible. In fact, organizations who have these executive roles are far stronger because they have learning and development at the table, sharing out things like capability gaps and how we get there. So definitely don't think it's out of the possibility, but certainly something to consider. All right, so how do we prepare for that role change before we get there? If you are looking to move from a specialist or individual contributor role to a training manager, you want to learn how to manage, right? So how are we managing priorities? How do we make decisions about competing priorities? You also need to be thinking about how to manage stakeholders, how to manage processes, how to manage outcomes. So really, I want you to hone in on that management piece of the role. How do I think through decisions? How do I delegate? How do I make sure that I understand how all of these processes fit together? If you're looking to go from training manager to maybe director or head of L&D, start thinking about your portfolio. So we're not thinking about individual programs anymore, but we got to think about how do all those programs fit together? What happens if someone goes through one and then another and then another? What's that progression look like? What's their overall experience with learning and development? Also start developing that discipline around resources and team capabilities. If you want to go from that director level to the VP or CLO, gosh, this is where you need to increase your executive exposure. So find a way to get in front of those executives. Also, spend some time on that financial fluency. We know that's going to be really important. And start thinking about how to influence across the enterprise. And that could be taking spending some time learning about marketing principles. It could be thinking through who the kind of key influencers are in your organization, but start thinking about that. And of course, any level to any level, you got to document. And this is one that I want to stress so much because you can think about what your career plan is all day, but if you haven't written it down, then you're going to be starting from scratch the next time. So make sure you're documenting everything. Document what results you have. Document what your plan is. Document where you're headed. Also start thinking about those sponsors who might be able to put you up for those extra pieces of work, and think about what work you might be interested in that would expand the scope around the areas that we talked about. We did ask aspiring senior executive leaders what they see as the biggest barrier to reaching that executive L&D level. And what's really interesting about these barriers is that they're not typically skills gaps. So I think aspiring senior executives feel really confident that they can develop the skill set to get there. But instead, they're seeing contextual barriers. So the structure, size of the organization, not really being able to get to that sponsorship or getting that visibility in front of executives. Maybe they have limited leadership experience or gaps in business acumen. So top two really being ones that are, how do I operate given the context in a way that'll help me overcome those barriers? So let's talk a little bit about the promotion trap. I think these apply generally speaking, but in an L&D context, if you're known for getting things done personally, you want to start working on how you build systems that others can use, right? Because that's going to demonstrate readiness to get into that management role. If you're known for saying yes to stakeholders, they probably love you. but they probably don't think that you're able to make those priority trade-offs. So start talking to them about the trade-offs and recommending when they shouldn't be doing those things. If you're known for really, really understanding the way that learning works, now you need to start connecting learning to all the different other operational zones across the business. How does learning interrelate to talent? How does it interrelate to the change that we're going through? Make sure that you're becoming an expert in all of those areas. If you're known for tracking and reporting training activity, now we got to get really good at explaining the implications. So we don't want to just say 80% went through our program, but we want to say that's bad because the other 20%, and here's the risk of them not going through. If you are known for solving L&D problems, now you need to start thinking about what those business problems are and start speaking in terms of those problems. So instead of talking about how we upskilled the workforce on this, we want to talk about how we equipped them to do this specific thing that is going to help us avoid this specific problem. And then finally, if you're really good at managing your team's workload, now you need to start backing up that focus and thinking more macro about your capacity within your function, about how it's structured, and about the strategy that you have in terms of what your resource load is. Okay, so I have a chat prompt for you. So this is a little interactivity, and I'm going to ask that you go ahead and chat in. Which of these risks that we just went over do you see as kind of your biggest risk in terms of moving up? And just use the number. You don't have to type the whole thing. But I'm curious, do you see yourself as more of a personal execution? Is that kind of getting in your way? Is it hard for you to kind of push back on their trade-off conversations? Maybe there's a lot of activity data to report, but hard to translate that into business implications. Limited opportunities to practice that senior work. Okay, so there's a lot of great answers coming in. Yeah. And if it's something else, tell us. I'm going to connect this to our next slide. And you guys can keep that coming, but our next slide is a self-reflection, and I'm going to give you 1 minute to do this. So I'm sorry, it's not enough time. Screenshot it, though, if you want to spend more time on the activity, but start thinking about and give yourself a rating on each of these 7 areas. And so pull out your pad of paper and just write it down. Are you low? Low is a 1, 5 is a high. How do you think you are? How capable are you at connecting learning priorities to business strategy? How capable are you at determining when training is not the right solution? And I'm going to pause and give you some quiet time to really write those things down. When you have that completed, go ahead and circle your lowest score. This is going to be your development clue. This is an area that I want you to start focusing on. So here we have mind the gap. What gap type is it? So you kind of know where the gap is. What type is it? Is it a skills gap? Is it a knowledge gap? Depending on what kind of gap you're experiencing, you have a different best development strategy. I do have a little resource here. This one is just our courses catalog. In some of these areas, particularly knowledge and skills and confidence, taking a course can be really helpful. So if you want to peruse our catalog, I'll have Christina pop that up. But depending on where your gap lies, you might decide to seek that executive exposure or kind of start developing who your career board is. If you have a confidence gap, you may want to think about a credential or something that would really validate your skill set. So I am going to move to the next slide because I know we're getting close to time, but we will make the slides available. So make sure you go access them so that you can kind of think about what that development strategy is and how it lines up. And I'm going to leave you with a 90-day plan. This is my challenge for you. I hope. I see some people lamenting. I see a lot of people kind of commiserating, which I think is so lovely and wonderful to hear that your peers are having similar kinds of issues. But I do hope that you're going to walk out of here and start thinking about what it is that you want to work on to get to that next level. Because we all came here for a particular reason. And maybe you aren't trying to get to the next level. Maybe you're trying to feel really confident at the level you are. But spend the next week, 2 weeks thinking about what you're trying to accomplish. Am I trying to be more effective at the level I am? Am I looking for that promotion? Figure that out. And then I want you to take a relevant assessment. So I am going to ask Christina to pop 2 assessments that will be beneficial to you all. We have our Training Manager Competency Assessment. We also have an Executive Readiness Assessment. So depending on where your focus area is, those 2 could be really beneficial to kind of assessing your readiness. But other ways to assess it, really look at where your struggles are across your day-to-day, talk to your peers, talk to your managers. These are great ways to kind of take stock of where you are. In the next 2 weeks, I want you to select one competency gap. So you might use the results of those assessments. You're going to get a detailed report to think about one of the competencies, or maybe you identified it by talking to your supervisor, but select one of those gaps that you really want to focus on. And then I want you to take a month and a half to think about completing some targeted development. Maybe you're going to take a course, maybe you're going to read, maybe you have coaching available in your organization, which I think is so wonderful. Go use that resource. Talk to them about how you want to develop this. But think about how you might develop in that area and spend some time on it. And part of that development is taking that area and trying to apply it to your real world, day-to-day business problems. So don't just read about it. Think about how it applies and see yourself using it on the job. And then go ask for feedback, which is, I know, scary, but gosh, how wonderful is it to go to your supervisor and say, I'm really trying to work on this area and I'd love some feedback on how I'm doing. I've been doing all this work to try to improve, and I'd love to hear whether you've noticed a difference. I mean, this is one of those great ways of really communicating where you're headed and making sure that they understand you're serious about your job. So go collect that data, go get some evidence of how you did, document the lessons that you learned as you were trying to apply this competency. And then the last one also, I think sometimes feels a little cringe, but write down what your story is. Put pen to paper. When you write it down, it becomes a lot easier for you to say it out loud. It also helps you to process what those things are, and then you can go back and look at that later. So create that readiness story. And then, by the way, this says 90 days. Do it in 180 days. Do it in 365. Whatever the amount of days that makes the most sense for you is fine, but don't stop there. Let's rinse and repeat. So at the end of this 90, 180, whatever amount of days, go back to the start and work back through it. With that, next steps in development, we had Christina share those 2 assessments that you can kind of get a gauge of where you are in terms of those 2 roles. If you're not sure where to start, we have a couple of great, amazing professional development experts here at Training Industry who are there to help you. So schedule a consultation. Christina will pop that resource as well. And it's so nice to get together and talk to somebody about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So do not neglect that resource. With that, I know we have 3 minutes, sorry. If there are any questions we can fit in, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, we will follow up and provide answers.
Yes, no, the audience, I think they've created besties today. So I'm so happy to see that kind of community fester within this conversation. So there were a lot of questions that they asked each other, but there were 2. So let's get in it. So one of the questions was, with the tenure data that you have, is strategic alignment growing or staying the same? Meaning, are folks assessing that they are moving away from transactional order taking to stronger alignment with the business?
Such a great question, Liz. No, it doesn't change over time. It is always rated the most important. The mean ratings, the percent who's selected as critical, they are always the same. In fact, it pretty much is consistent over time, which is weird because the role kind of has shifted. The only one that changes, and it's ever so slight, but managing technology has grown in importance over time, which is not shocking.
Perfect. And with that, we'll do one last question, which you kind of touched on a little, but Cynthia had asked, they have been a small business owner in the adult education space for 20 plus years. And I find it hard to translate my experience to more traditional corporate L&D environments. So do you have any advice or, data that you've kind of experienced in that realm?
Yeah. Well, so one, you're not alone. This is such a common pathway into corporate training. And two, we have a ton of articles and resources on this on our website. So I'll try to get it into the email that we send out. But if not, do a search. We have Alyssa Kazicki wrote this great article about shifting paradigms when you move from one space to the other. And we also have, I think it was Jenny Ayers wrote another article where she interviewed a ton of people who made this shift and what their advice is. So we have a lot of resources on it. Just get your keywords right and do a search, and I think you'll be able to find it.
Beautiful. Well, with that, Dr. Amy, that is all the questions that I think we have. There might have been a couple snuck in the chat. Is there anything else you would leave with the audience today before we wrap it up and say our goodbyes?
And now I just want to say hats off to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to focus in on your career development. And that's the first step. So congratulations and keep working on it.
Yes. The inspirational vibes on the Thursday. I know everyone else is feeling it as well. Thank you so much, Amy, for allowing this environment and energy today. I appreciate you. And so for everyone else, I do invite you for some more up and coming webinars when we're talking about, progressing our career. We do have some cool events more this month. So you can register for these programs and you can watch past webinars. So if you loved what we talked about today, it will be on the site end of the day, so you can rewatch today's. And all of our webinars are pre-qualified for a credit hour by HRCI, SHRM, ISPI, and CPTM. So if you're a CPTM, good news, you just plug this event easily in your tracker. But if you have any issues, please do not hesitate to reach out to our team. And then for SHRM and HRCI, just send an email to me or anybody on the TI team, and we will send you those codes shortly. And so with that, we do additionally want to share out some more resources. I know we have thrown a bunch at you. Amy will send you more. So I just wanted to reiterate, training industry, we offer a ton of certificates and a full suite of certifications. So for learning professionals, so you can check out and view our course catalog at trainingindustry.com/course catalog. And additionally, our Training Industry Strategy Summit. This is 3 days of intensive learning and collaboration. You leave equipped with tools, frameworks, and insights to lead an L&D strategy with confidence. You'll leave inspired, but also equipped to implement measurable change in your organization. And lastly, that evaluation survey should have popped open another tab in your browser, and we would appreciate hearing your feedback from today's event. And then again, thank you to Dr. Amy for just an amazing session today. But lastly, I thank you for your time and attention today. I hope to see you next time. I am Liz. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and I will see you all very soon. Bye, everybody.